Wait for it, and we're live. Hey, all you crazy sci-fi and fantasy fans. It's time for your daily dose of shenanigans over here at the Blasters and Blades podcast. Just a couple of nerdy veterans and one chaos coordinator geeking out over our science fiction passions and fantastical fantasies. A place where magic is king, the sky is the limit, and space is the place. We are the podcast that puts the fun in dysfunction. So without further ado, we're going to let our guest, Miss Colleen Story, introduce herself to our listeners and viewers. And unfortunately, all the good stuff, we were like spent 15 minutes in the pre-show chatting and having fun. I'm like, crap, we could have filmed this, but life happens.
Now we have to repeat it, right?
Right, absolutely. Pretend it didn't happen.
Stop, redo. Okay.
There you go.
My name is Colleen M. Story. I am a full-time freelance writer in the health and wellness industry. During the day, I write books. In my off time, I'm a hybrid author, both novels and nonfiction books for writers. I'm also a musician. I play the French horn in the local symphony and pit orchestras, and I teach music lessons on piano and trumpet and French horn and trombone. And I'm also a country girl. I was raised on a 10-acre ranch with just about every animal you can imagine. And I now live in the beautiful state of Idaho, surrounded by potato and wheat fields. So it looks like I have a huge backyard.
Yeah, but I hear you can make batteries out of potatoes, so you're good if the apocalypse.
I have heard that, yes. So we are up to speed on the survival area.
Absolutely. So have you seen the traveling Idaho spud that's like on the back of a trailer?
I have not. Well, I've seen it on the news. It's like they tell you after it's already gone through, they show you the news. Oh, the potato is here today. Dang it. Where was it? I have not been able to see it yet.
Because I'm a kid of the 80s, seeing that in person in the Oscar Mayer Wienermobile are two things I have to do. Like, you got to do it before you die. It's just one of those things. It's on the list.
Well, and I just feel silly because you see those things like, man, I need to see this. You can't be from Idaho and not see this. But unfortunately, I haven't yet. I have, however, had potatoes out of the field, and you can't get any better. I mean, it's like they say, of anywhere that grows like food from like Georgia peaches or whatever, Idaho potatoes taste different. They're just sweeter than anything you can get in the store. They're awesome. They were harvesting them out behind me one year, and as the trucks go out onto the road, they dump some because they're going over the bumps. So there's like this huge pile just right on the edge of my property, and I had potatoes for months.
My Scottish ancestors are screaming in joy that you love the potatoes. So do they care that you grab them, or do they
No, they actually encourage you to, because they can't do anything with them. They just go to waste if somebody doesn't pick them up. So everybody in the area knows that if the trucks drop some off, they're free game.
So that's like vegetarian roadkill.
Yes, but a lot better. It's not smashed and smushed. There's no gory aspects to it.
This is true. I mean, you can't, like you said, potatoes. I know. Have you got the Idaho cookbook of like 1,001 ways to cook them? I hear it's required.
I'm not really, I don't spend a lot of time in the kitchen. It's like, to me, that always feels kind of like a waste of time. So I just do the quick baking or, cook them up in the microwave.
I mean, you do what you got to do.
That's right.
You'll up your game eventually. You'll cook it on the grill with the stove or with the steaks. I'm going through my grilling man phase right now. So, it's just one of those things you have to do in life at some point.
I bet they would be awesome.
I imagine they would be even better. I've gotten some from the farmer's market, and they're already better than like what you get at like the Kroger or whatever, like Piggly Wiggly, whatever store's local to you. But I imagine, that's about the same, probably even fresher because they're fresher to the ground.
Yeah. Oh, they're unlike anything I've ever had, because, we have Idaho potatoes in the stores here, of course, but they're way better than those even. There's just something about having them out of the field. I was raised in Colorado, and we had peach orchards there, and you don't get peaches like that anywhere else. It's just, I don't know, there's something different about having them right out of the ground.
Absolutely. That's why if when I win the lottery and get my homestead, I'm definitely adding like fruit and nut bearing trees. Like, none of that decorative roses and crap. Everything I'm going to spend time on is going to produce something I can consume.
Just be ready to really work hard, because they take a lot of time and effort. My folks actually on the ranch that I grew up on, they put a lot of it into peaches a couple of years ago, and they leased the land so somebody else is taking care of it. But it's like a constant. You're always doing something to make sure those trees stay healthy.
It's good to know. I was thinking of like mixing it up, some apples. They've recently found, because I'm a history nut, they recently found the George Washington's hard apple cider recipe, and then they backwards engineered it to cover the parts that were just, unfortunately, things get lost to history because we just assume people know things. Like you just, well, why would I tell you that? Everyone knows that. That's common knowledge. Well, then when it's not common knowledge and it's not written down, you're in trouble. So they backwards engineered his hard cider recipe, and I'd like to try making it someday.
Absolutely. Yeah, you should.
Because then you're drinking history. Drink with old Georgie. So, and I'm told you have to like give the opposite of whatever a toast to the crown is when you do that, though.
Oh, yeah, I think that would be wise.
Yeah, you don't want to insult your ancestors.
Absolutely not.
All right, are you ready for the religion question?
I think so. I'll try.
All right, Star Wars, Star Trek, or Firefly?
Okay, quick answer is all three. Star Trek came first because when I was growing up, my older brother used to watch it. And so I got into it that way. Then later is when Star Wars came out, was after that. So then I was a huge Star Wars fan. Probably that's the biggest one for me. And then it was much later that I was introduced to Firefly and really enjoyed that. So all three.
Yeah, sadly, I found Firefly after it was already canceled in the like Serenity.
I did too.
I was in college doing my thing when this show was on its heyday, and this was before even DVR that it came out. So unfortunately, I missed it. But you know, a show is doomed when it goes on Fox Entertainment because that's where all good shows go.
Well, they all didn't last very long. I mean, Star Trek was only 3 years, right? So yeah.
But seasons back then were longer.
True.
So like I think Firefly got like 12 episodes, something like that, maybe 16. I can't remember.
Yeah, really.
Like seasons are a lot shorter now. Whereas when they would syndicate, like you might get 52 episodes in a year. So that's how you got the spaghetti westerns, because they were just hardworking mofos.
That's right. So, yeah, there was none of this, shoot a few episodes and then take 6 months off.
No, they were hardworking. That's when Hollywood had a work ethic.
Yes.
All right. And because we are polytheistic, Game of Thrones, The Wheel of Time, or Chronicles of Narnia?
Game of Thrones for sure. And that also I was just introduced to a while back. And I forget who introduced me to that, but I got into it and then got into it big time. Introduced my younger brother to it, and we've become big fans after that. And I'm actually just now reading the books. The TV series is where I found it first, and now I'm reading the books.
Did you like the ending, or would you feel let down? I know there's people are on the fence with that one. You go one way or the other.
It is an on the fence ending, but I could see the logic in it. I mean, I think as a writer, you look at it from that point of view too, as well as just what you wanted to have happen. So I kind of thought it was logical, and I was just so impressed with how the TV side of it, the production that they did for that. I mean, those last few episodes could have been movies easily, well done movies. So yeah, I was okay with it.
Are you normally a fan of grimdark?
No.
Because I know that's one of the reasons, the big complaints. That's why I wasn't as big a fan of George R.R. Martin's series, because it just was too dark. Like I prefer, I don't mind darkness if there's a light at the end of the tunnel that isn't a train coming to smash you to pieces. It was just a little too dark for me. But that's a personal preference. That doesn't mean there's anything wrong with it. Some people love it because they like those dark shows, and some people like it in spite of it. I think I
think I was in the latter. I'm not usually well, I don't know. Maybe I should check that. I'm not like a horror fan. I'm like not super dark, but I do like gritty, realistic gritty, and no, sugarcoating what actually the characters might go through, depending on what their journeys are in any individual story. So yeah, I mean, to me, it all seemed to ring true pretty much for what would happen to those people.
I don't mind the darkness if there's the light and the hope to balance it, but I like to know that there's a chance for good versus evil and good to triumph. It's the ambiguity, I think, that gets me. The who's really the good guy. I don't really like any of the characters because they all seem, not just George R. R. Martin, I'm just more broadly, like when you can't really like any of the characters because they delve into the gray. I don't know. Just for me, I'd rather have clearly defined good and evil.
You want the good guys there.
I mean, yeah. I mean, there's the running joke about, like with Star Wars, oh, the Empire was the good guys and Jedis are terrorists. And I'll tell those jokes too, because there is some ambiguity. But then there are other times where the bad guys do really bad things. And you're like, oh, okay, I can see it here. So I don't mind a little bit of gray enough to tease. But I really do like to know in the end who I'm supposed to be rooting for, who the good guy and who the bad guy is, because life is complicated, so fiction doesn't have to be.
Got you.
All right. So what's your favorite dinosaur? Because they don't ask us enough as adults.
Okay, so when I was growing up, my older brother and I used to play with dinosaurs, and then my favorite was the Brontosaurus every time because I thought that was the quote nice dinosaur. But when I think of dinosaurs now, it's the Ankylosaurus I think of. I used one of those actually in my last book, The Beached Ones, in a scene between the two brothers. The little brother was playing with dinosaurs and getting his older brother to guess what this dinosaur was. And that's the first one that came to my mind when I was writing that scene. So I don't know. I don't know what that says that I have that little guy in my mind. But when I was playing as a kid, it was definitely Brontosaurus.
So did you get into the Jurassic Park franchise at all?
Yeah, I really enjoyed it when that first came out because it was cutting edge what they did with the graphics and all, and to see the dinosaurs running around. I really loved the original. After that, I wasn't quite as much of a fan.
Yeah, it was. I really love the original. It surprisingly holds up. I've watched it with my teenagers, and it's still. I mean, that sense of awe when you hear the music and the first time the archaeologist sees a living dinosaur, like.
Yeah.
When you watch somebody else capture that for the first time, the feeling is still there and it ages. The newer ones I liked. I've watched the entire franchise to include Camp Cretaceous, which is like the cartoon for kids, 4 seasons. But you would think they would learn after a while that, hey, this really can't be controlled. But no, we're going to keep doing it to the point where Camp Cretaceous ends after Jurassic World, the last movie. Oh, by the way, they're just fact of life. They're living on the American continent now, because they've gotten off the islands.
Right.
I would think
it makes for fun. It makes for fun. You know, a lot of fun and games in the middle is what they say that your middle of your story is.
It's all fun and games. The T-Rex eat your mama.
That's right.
All right. Because we are civilized human beings here at the Blasters and Blades podcast, coffee or tea, and how do you take it?
I am both because my mom's side of the family is all Irish. And so we were able to go to Ireland. It was like the early 2000s to backtrack and find some of my older family members back there. And they make the best tea. Again, it's like where the food comes from. On the plane out there, they offered us coffee or tea. The coffee was horrendous. This is on the Irish Airlines. The tea was amazing. It's like, how do they make tea taste this good? And it was that way the whole time we were over there. So my parents have always been tea drinkers. Every time you turn around, you're sitting down to have a cup of tea, which I now kind of have grown to appreciate because it's something that kind of brings all the family together. Even now, when I go home, we sit down and have a cup of tea. It's kind of nice. Personally, I love coffee. It's kind of funny because my brother was asking me a little while back how I got to like coffee in the first place. And I said, when we used to visit my neighbor friends, we had family friends that lived across the street. And I was quite young then. I was like 5. And I said, their names were Jan and John. And John used to fix me coffee in this little Snoopy cup. And he'd put some cream and sugar in it. And I loved it. I just loved the taste of it. And my mom didn't know that he was doing that until I recently told this story. She said, he did what? She didn't know that he was feeding me coffee when I was only 5. But I think I just had no choice after that point to love coffee. So from that point on, I did. And I've always have coffee first thing in the morning and usually just with a little bit of cream. French vanilla is my favorite.
Excellent choice. French vanilla is mine as well.
Oh, all right.
Yeah, I started drinking in college out of necessity because you want to stay awake, and then like after a while, when you add the right amount of cream and sugar, it's really, really good. Although now that I've been dieting, I have to drink it black because there's no calories that way.
Yeah.
But I do on occasion. I will splurge and I'll add my French vanilla creamer to it, which is just really, really good.
It's so good. Yeah, I just do the one in the morning that gets me going, and the rest of the day I'm on the tea. So.
Well, I do. I brew mine extra strong, so that way when I water it down, so to speak, it's still strong coffee with the cream instead of like weak coffee with cream.
Right.
So I get the best of both worlds. But now I have to drink it without the cream because I put too much. So it's like, I mean, that's basically a meal substitute at a certain point in time.
Well, you can get to where you can kind of get used to it. I mean, I typically like the light roast, but I've tried some darker ones lately and I'm starting to kind of like those too. So yeah, I think you can adapt.
Well, I'm going to have to, because, gotta get skinny for your health. So the working with the nutritionist through the VA, and they're like, yeah, you'll fit back in your uniform by Christmas at this rate. So
Nice.
gotta have a goal. I don't know what I'd wear it for because I'm a civilian.
I was gonna say, you're gonna do like a photo shoot.
I don't know, like maybe. Although I'd have, if I was doing regulation, I'd have to shave the beard. So that's not happening. Although I jokingly told this story. My first sergeant, when I was in on my last deployment, who's no longer with us, but he used to get on us all the time about our mustaches being regulation. I mean, it really wasn't as bad as like the Marines first sergeant in was a generation kill, but I mean, he was up there. So I thought about taking a picture in my dress blues with my full beard. And I like my mustache now, and leaving it at Arlington with him.
Oh, you definitely should do that.
He'd get a kick out of it if he was around. So
I'm sure he would.
All right. So how did you get into the writing game? Like, obviously it's your day job in that you write nonfiction. So how did you, one, make writing a career in general and then transition into the fiction?
Yeah, it kind of came out of the blue. I studied music early on. I was a musician before I was a writer. So I went through college and got my music education degree. But then I moved right after college to Idaho. I was in Colorado, moved to Idaho. And in order to have taught in Idaho, I would have had to go back to college and take more classes to get my certification in this state. At that point, I was tired of school. It had been, the 4-year music degree is a tough one. You're taking 21, 22 hours a semester, and you're, practicing 7-8 hours a week, weekends, a day to get ready for all your recitals. So at that point, I didn't want to go back to school right away. And I kind of wanted to think, was this really where I want to go? Because I had enjoyed my student teaching experience, but I learned while I was student teaching in a high school that there was no time to teach. You're so busy getting ready for the next basketball game or for the next trip you're taking the kids on, or you have a parents meeting, or you have some festival you have to prepare for, that you're just constantly, play, get this song ready and go. So we had kids in the band that weren't learning anything, from week to week. And so if I hadn't been there to be able to take them out and teach them while the director was doing the regular class, they wouldn't have learned anything that whole semester. And I didn't really like that. So I thought I would probably prefer teaching privately where I can actually teach, and maybe doing something else. So I took a break. And during that time, I really don't know why. I had always enjoyed writing, but I'd never thought of doing it as a career or even writing a book. I just had always written for fun. And went into a Sears store, saw a Brother word processor, shows you how long ago that was, and had to have it. For some reason, it just hit me. I had to have it. And I got it and took it home and started writing that day. And within 3 years, had my first short story published. And shortly after that, got my first job as a writer with a corporation. So that's kind of how it took off. And I feel like, this is where I belong. So somehow it found me, and I'm glad it did, because, I wouldn't want to be working full time in the schools right now. I really enjoy teaching private music lessons, but I'm glad that I'm not doing that. I really enjoy the freelance life as a writer. So yeah, that's how it started. I worked for the corporation for 3.5 years, and then I went out on my own and started working freelance.
So you came into it, you wrote short stories, decided this is fun, and somewhere along the way, you got a job on the nonfiction side. So you didn't start with nonfiction. Okay. What kind of story was the first one you wrote?
It was a children's story, actually. And I got published, and I got paid $10 for it. So there you go.
$10 is $10.
That's right. And it showed me the possibilities,
Did you spend it all in one place?
I don't even remember what I spent it on. I took like a copy of the check and framed it. I don't know what happened to the money.
Valid. Yeah, I didn't think to keep my first royalty check either.
Really?
Now I wish I did. I wonder if I can go.
Yeah, it's cool. I mean, I have it up on my writing desk to this day.
I mean, everything's so digital these days. I'm like, I think I got a PayPal transfer is what happened.
Oh.
So
no, I actually got a physical check, so that was cool.
That's nice. Is the short story still available for print or in print for people?
Oh no, it was published in a little journal at the time. The journal's not alive anymore. And it was just a little short children's story, and I haven't done anything else with it since then. It was just kind of a way to get off the ground and get started. And when I was applying for the job as a copywriter, they asked for a sample article. So I actually had to do a nonfiction one for that. But I was kind of used to that because I was always good at doing essays and stuff in school. That was never hard for me. So that's kind of how I got the job out of all the applicants, was the test article and the interviews and whatever. So I was kind of like thrown into the fire being a copywriter with the company, because there wasn't really anyone to guide me through. I kind of had to just jump in, and I found a couple of books, one by Robert Bly on copywriting, and just dove into it. And I'm really glad for all that, because obviously it led to my freelance career, but there's also a lot of things that you learn as a copywriter that then help you with marketing books too later on.
That makes sense. So does the way you tell stories or the way you write in the nonfiction side affect the way you tell stories on the fiction side, or are they kind of two separate for you?
That's a really good question. No, it's totally two separate things. And it feels like totally two separate sides of the brain. I prefer writing fiction. That's my fun. That's my escape. And even when I started working for the corporation, I was going in an hour early to write on my novels, because that was my dream, was to publish a novel. But it feels like a completely different process. It feels like nonfiction is very logical and very, stepwise, whereas in fiction, I'm very much a pantser. So I'm just going with wherever it takes me. So it's two completely different things. I don't even know if they complement each other, honestly, because even the tone and the rhythm and the flow is different depending on what you're doing. So I don't know. I mean, the nonfiction seems to pay the bills a little bit better. I'll put it that way.
So I noticed that in, as a history degree. And so you write a different style for that. And the academic writing, which is what essentially nonfiction is a lot of, it's a lot different. Sentence structure is different. They don't get their, knickers in a twist if you give a lot of conjunctive clauses and such. I had to learn to limit that when I started writing fiction, because then you can get terse reading, and that's not always a good thing. You don't want to pull people's head out of the story where they have to dissect every sentence and what you meant, So you definitely learn to be more concise and clear, I think. Sometimes that's a good thing. Sometimes it's a bad thing. There's room for nuance that you can sometimes lose, but it's definitely different. I can see that. Is there any truth to the rumor that you had to take a space shuttle to the ISS in order to get private time to write these days?
No truth as far as I know, but like I say, I would go in early before anybody else got there to be able to get the time. And it's the other reason, finding the time to write is so hard. The other reason that I went freelance was for that reason, because I wanted more time to work on my fiction. And I knew working for a corporation, it was never going to happen, because anybody who's worked corporate knows you're there till 1 a.m. And especially the writing team everybody wanted to have an input into what we were doing as far as what the written message was. And everybody thinks they're a writer. So they're, saying, oh, can we change this little thing? Can we change this little thing? And then some other vice president wants to change this and change that. So you're endlessly there, late hours, weekend hours. And I knew that I'd never reach my fiction writing dreams doing that. So that's why I went freelance.
For those who are listening and not watching, I was making a joke, but she's got her background set as a space shuttle view, which I absolutely love. I mean, it's way better than the standard generic green screen if you need to, give yourself a better backdrop.
Yeah, when I started doing when I started a YouTube channel, I knew I needed something because I didn't have anywhere in the house that I felt like I would be attractive to share on a YouTube video. So I needed a backdrop of some sort, and I went looking for backdrops. And this one just appealed to me for some reason. I think that shows part of my inner nerd, because, it's like, oh, I could be out in space giving these videos. And it just makes me feel kind of happy and creative, which I figure would be good for doing videos.
Yeah, I mean, your options are, if you don't have already ideal places, to make a set or buy a backdrop. And backdrops are right, cool because you can put them away when you're done. A lot easier than a set.
True.
Yeah. So, all right. So the next part of the introduction, dear listener, 25 minutes in, is where I tell you how we first met. This one was actually easy for me because her PR person reached out to the podcast, and that happens to us periodically. Where they'll come and say, hey, you want to talk to our people, and if it's a fit for the show, we have them on. I have no problem with people reaching out that way, and kind of glad she did, because she's been a lot of fun so far. Fingers crossed we keep this streak going. So what made you? Well, first off, we were talking in the pre-show when I was asking about, your any connection to the military, because we try to focus on that. So did you serve in the military?
I did not, but my family is very pro-military because my dad was a Marine and he actually served in World War II. He was quite a bit older than my mom, but you would have never known it if you knew him. And he was Marine through and through. I think anybody that I've talked to since that has family members that are Marine know what I'm talking about. Because, he was one of those that first thing in the morning, chop, chop, let's go, let's go. He's shouting at the bottom of the stairs. Get going, Yeah, that's right. Exactly. Those sayings were all there. And haste makes waste and all those things. My brothers and I chuckle these days of all the sayings that my dad has that we still refer to because they were wise. At those times, they were just kind of irritating when we were growing up, but they were wise. And so I really admired him because he was so very strong as a person and really extremely smart and knew how to fix everything. And so, yeah, my dad was a Marine, and then my older brother was Coast Guard. He's a Coast Guard veteran. He went to the Coast Guard Academy and then served. And my younger brother is an Air Force veteran. He went to the Air Force Academy and then served, and he's now a pilot for United Airlines.
Just not Boeing. I hear they got some problems. So do you think growing up with that experience of kind of affects the way you envision stories and characters?
Oh, man. Well, I don't know about characters, but it sure did affect my viewpoint of the world. I mean, one of the things my dad constantly drilled into us all the time was how lucky we were to be Americans, over and over and over. And he would speak about his, time overseas and what he saw. And he would say over and over again, if you're born in this country, you are the luckiest person on the earth and you have no excuses. You go out there and you make it happen and you work hard and you get what you need. But he just said that all the time. And growing up, that just seemed normal to me. I realize now that is not normal at all. That doesn't happen in a lot of families. But because of that, and also because of my mom's devotion equally to helping us to learn history, we used to go back and visit my grandma who lives in upstate New York. And every year that we would go back, we would stop at some sort of historical location, many times the presidential museums, and learn about the history of the country. So it definitely influenced me that way. And I think if I were to say how it influenced my writing, probably just the work ethic, because my dad and my mom both were very hard workers and believed in hard work. And so, I think you have to have that as a writer today. You have to work hard. There's so much that we have to do, and it's not something where you can just sit back and glide. You have to not only write and edit and market and all these things. So I think probably that is what was left over for me in being raised in a military family.
I think a lot of people buy into the mystique of what an author is because they see it on the TV show, someone with a tweed jacket and the smoking the pipe or cigar with their scotch, and they're typing away, every 15 minutes they might type a word or something, and somehow the money just gets in a dump truck and backed up to their front porch. It doesn't work that way. Like, most of the authors have multiple jobs to pay for it. They're doing good if they break even. And then the idea that the traditional publishing companies will do all the marketing and stuff for you, where all you got to do is, they got to do that too, which is why so many authors went independent. It was like, if I'm doing it anyway, why don't I keep more of the money? And so, yeah, I definitely could see where, you would need that to self-motivate, because there's no one telling you, hey, you got to get this done. You're kind of have to be your own boss.
So true. So true. And it kind of helps to have my dad's voice in the back of my head. Chop, chop, let's get going. Like you said, time's a waste. And those things kind of had stayed with me.
I could definitely see that. My dad was like that too.
Yeah.
I come from a long line of military. So it's just, when you think that's normal, and then you talk to people that didn't have that experience, and they're like, wait, what? Like, you mean your dad didn't do that? What's that like?
I know. I would have no idea. I would be clueless.
I remember, I have distinct memory when I'm at boot camp and we're in the barracks in the Bay the first time they're showing us how to make the hospital corners on the bed. I'm like, I got you, fam. My dad did this to me when I was 12. So I made it. And they were yelling at me. The whole point of yelling at me was, well, if I knew what I was doing, I should be helping other people. It's the teamwork part that I missed initially. But when they're yelling at me, all I could think of is, man, my mom did the mean way better than you.
It was the same in my family for sure.
I was smart enough not to say that out loud. I had one thing going for me at least. All right, so before we start talking about King Midas, since we're about the halfway point, I'm going to play the commercial. And while we pause for this commercial, we appreciate your patronage, Katie, and roll that footage.
Hey there, this is author Katie Cross. I'm coming at you with an offer for a best-selling fantasy audiobook titled Flame, and it's totally for free. Here's a little bit more about it. Dragon servants Sana and Isadora Spence live deep in Leadham Wood, where persnickety dragons and wars on the borders are the least of their worries. Thanks to years of simmering tension, the hidden village is destined to crack, and soon. Sana's deep love for the giant beast causes her to make an irreversible mistake, while Isadora's disinterest in the dragons leads her to a fateful decision that will change the course of the entire world. Can the sisters prevent everything they know from falling apart? Or do they allow it to break and pave the way for new growth? Join the beloved sister witches in Flame, the first book in the Dragon Master trilogy. Just go to www.katiecrossbooks.com/flame-audiobook to get your free copy today.
All right, thank you for sticking with us through that commercial interlude. We appreciate your patronage, Katie, friend of the show. Now that we're back with all of that, and we've done the commercial break, and we've done the how we like our nerds chat, what can you tell us? So you came on to talk about your book, maybe Sunday. You came to talk about your book, The Curse of King Midas. So where did the idea come from, and like what can you tell us about the story? Let's dive in.
I love sharing the story behind this because I never would have thought that I'd be talking about this kind of story 3 years ago. My novels have been all generally in the fantasy category. First one was like an epic fantasy, and then the two after that were more supernatural. But this one, and I mentioned I was a musician, I often play in the orchestra with a very fine trumpet player friend of mine, and he's also a conductor and a music composer. And he approached me one day after he had read my second novel, Lorena's Gift, and he said, "Would you be interested in writing the story of King Midas?" And his original thinking there was that he might like to write a musical about the story one day. And he told me that the best musicals are always based on books, that he had done a bunch of research on them, and that the story always comes from a book. So he said, "You can do whatever you want with it, but if you're interested, it might be fun." So, no guarantee of whether anything like that would ever happen, but I got to thinking about it, and I thought, well, that would be maybe kind of fun. So I started doing the research on the myth and was really surprised and excited to find out that King Midas was a real person. There was a real King Midas who ruled in the late 700s and early 600s BC. He was the ruler of the kingdom of Phrygia from the city of Gordium, which they are still to this day excavating. The University of Pennsylvania is over there digging the site right now. And it was just the weirdest kind of bizarre thing where things happen, it seems like, at the right time. I started researching the whole thing and found that they were doing the dig right now. They're getting these, you see pictures of how the city was laid out, what they're finding, and what they're learning about King Midas. And so I was able to combine the history of the real King Midas with the myth of King Midas and the touch of gold and all of that when creating this story. And it ended up being one of the most fun times I've had writing a story ever. So it just it's not something I initially would have done, but now that it's happened, I'm really excited about it. And I didn't imagine initially that it would be a series. But I got to the end of book one. It has a satisfying ending, but there's a couple of characters that you kind of wonder what happened to them. And some of my beta readers were asking me if I was going to have a sequel to it. So that's now it is going to be a series. I've already finished the draft of the second book. And again, I'm pulling from history as far as what really happened during that time for part of the backdrop of the story.
Nice. Any update on the musical portion of it?
No, I mean, my friend is one of these people who's got his fingers in many irons in the fire, or whatever how you say it, and so he's constantly directing new plays. We're practicing right now to do Marriage of Figaro, the opera theater here in town, and we're both in the symphony, and he's always doing these extra things. So I don't know if he'll ever have the time to sit down and do it or not, but I thank him for the original idea, and if he ever does want to do it, I'm there to write the script.
Nice. So prior to that idea, were you at least tangentially aware of the myth around the Midas touch and King Midas?
Yeah, I think like most people, I mean, you know about it, right, JR? Most people,
Yeah.
when you say, do you know the King Midas story? Most people do. The fact that he was like seen as too greedy and wanted the touch of gold so he could have gold everywhere. And that's kind of what the story was about. For me, I think part of the reason I was doing research on it is I couldn't really relate to the greed motivation. It didn't seem like enough for a book. I wanted to raise the stakes a little bit more. So being able to find the real history there gave me that. In my story, King Midas is not motivated by greed. He's motivated by revenge. So it gave me a handle that made the story, much more interesting and fun to write because the stakes are a lot higher.
Okay. So how much can you tell us about your interpretation of King Midas as a character? Without spoilers, obviously.
Right. Well, it's kind of like I have to think because the real King Midas and my fictional King Midas now feel like two different people, because the real King Midas obviously has none of the myth of influencing him, and whereas my character does.
I'm speaking
The real
specifically of
King,
your character.
my character, yeah, I was going to say the real King Midas was beloved. From what they can tell, his city was a thriving city, and the people did do well. Few records survive from that time from the kingdom of Phrygia. What they know about him was written by neighboring kingdom Assyria at the time. So it's kind of hard to know what the people might have thought of him, but they do know that they did well. They were a thriving kingdom. And my character is very devoted to family. That did come across from the myth, because I think if anybody remembers the myth, the fact that he was very devoted to his daughter. And so that is the case in my story as well. He's very devoted to his children. In the myth, there is also a son of King Midas named Onkeris. And so he has a son and a daughter, very devoted to them. And then he has also a sister. And there's a backstory there that explains the need that he has for revenge against his rival, who is King Sargon. And of course, King Sargon II was also a real person in history.
So Sargon of Acadia, is that who you're speaking of specifically?
Yes. Well, not the first one. There was King Sargon II. So the first one was quite a ways before that. King Sargon II lived at the same time as King Midas did.
Okay. Yeah, even in some of the myths, depending on the translation of the Midas story, it was greed, but it was greed for the purpose of family legacy. Like it was the danger of trying, going too far in an effort to create a legacy, I think was one of the life lessons in theory it was teaching. It got simplified later to just greed bad. But the original myths and legends and lore in general were a lot more nuanced. They assumed you were smarter back then. And so they didn't dumb everything down. I think the other part of that is they just spent more time thinking. Like they're more time quiet in their head, where they were just contemplating, life and all the things.
Didn't have so many distractions. Yeah.
Yeah, as I say, I mean, if you want that quiet moment now, you have to like consciously make effort for it. Whereas back then, I mean,
you had many of them that you might not have really wanted.
Right. I mean, that was the default. That. I imagine some of them would be like, wait, well, no, give me all the distractions.
Exactly.
All I'm doing is like churning my butter or whatever.
I want to listen to a podcast.
Right. So I don't know. It's interesting to see that you go back to the more, I guess, more historically accurate kind of information to make this tale. I think the Disneyfication of folklore these days has gotten a lot of people. I mean, if you tell someone that mermaids weren't Ariel, that they were actually scary sirens that killed people, they would be shocked and horrified. That it's not the prim and proper girly thing to see a mermaid. Like, you know what I mean? Like, that was just no. And most of the Grimm's fairy tales, for instance, they were dark.
Very dark, for sure.
So yeah, it's interesting. Now, did you have to like intentionally decide? Well, let me ask this then. What would the rating be if you were like a Hollywood movie? If you're going to rate it on like PG, R, like for your target audience?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know if it goes so far as to be R, maybe PG-13. There's definitely some violence. There's some fighting scenes. There's one scene that is that could be pretty tough depending on how they filmed it. You know, it always depends on how much they show. So in between those two, I do like to have, like I don't write a bunch of gore or anything like that, but I do like to have action. I do like to have stakes. You know, I like readers to worry about the characters, and you know, I think we as writers also worry about them as we're writing the scenes. So I would say maybe between PG-13, probably right around there. I do think that older teenagers can read this book just fine. It is adult fantasy, probably not for 12 or under, but I think anybody else would be fine reading it. You know, there's some motivations, especially on King Sargon's side, that are not so not so PG. He's not a good guy in a lot of ways as far as what his motivations are and what he does. But you know, I write about those in a way that it can be readable without making someone feel, you know, overly uncomfortable.
Okay. Did you intentionally, like, you know, set a line? I won't cross this on the violence and gore and all that. Is that something you had to go intentionally? Because most of the time, you know, as a classically trained historian, I can tell you that most of the time, what they write about history, they need to up the brutality by about 10, generally speaking, especially when they talk about the Romans. So is that something you intentionally said, hey, I'm going to keep it, you know, anything above this is going to happen off screen?
I don't know if I do that intentionally. I think that's just kind of how I write, because the last book I did, the Beached Ones, also had some pretty difficult scenes in it. The last one, there's plenty of details there, but I don't think that me personally as a reader, I like something that's gritty and realistic, but I don't need to see all the detailed, gory stuff. So I think it's just kind of how I write that it ends up being that way. And usually I'm trying to create a scene for the purpose of the story. What's pushing the story forward. And so I'll put in there what needs to be there, but I won't go, you know, any farther just to have that in there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like sometimes, you know, there are some authors that add that gratuitously just for the sake of writing it or having it, where it doesn't really further the plot. And even though I don't mind the violence or the other mature content, you want it to feel like it's there for a reason.
Right. Exactly. Sure. Yeah, I'm with you there. And in mine, it is that way. Although so much of the story is about, you know, the interaction with the family. And then there's goddesses, of course, because there was a god that granted Midas this power initially. I changed that to a goddess, which made more sense to me. I mean, what kind of god would want, you know, to get after a king this way, to curse him like this? It would have to be a woman, right? And so it ended up being goddess that curses him. And so there's that interaction between him and the goddesses, and then him and his family, and then him and Sargon, and Sargon's interaction with the characters that are around him. And so there's the movement as far as who's battling whom here and there, but that's not the most of the story.
So because this is fantasy, obviously you've got the deity angle. What other fantasy elements or tropes did you include?
That might be the only one. There are 2 goddesses involved, and they will continue to be involved in the rest of the series with the addition of one more. And so they have their magic. The goddesses have their magic that is present there, which is, you know, the bulk of the fantasy element in the story. I don't know if I'd have to kind of, maybe you can remind me of some of the standard tropes that I'm trying to think if there's any others that are in there.
So is it just humans, or do you have fantasy races involved?
No, there's just humans and the gods. So yeah, it is not
Okay.
going into a fantasy world that far, because again, I'm kind of centering it in what really happened in history at that time, and then bringing that mythological magic in there with the goddesses and how they influenced. They're kind of influencing a little bit of what's going on between both of the kings. So it just kind of, I'm adding their involvement to some extent, and then they have their own stories as well.
Is there any of the monsters and stuff? Because it sounds like you're pulling from the ancient legends and lore. So did you bring any of those monsters forward?
Not yet, no, and I don't think I will. I've been so fascinated by the characters themselves and what they had to face in history, because I mean that's enough. What they had to go through as far as different kingdoms fighting different kingdoms, and then in the second book, this is a little bit of a spoiler, but the Sumerians came down from the northeast and started penetrating this area where King Midas and King Sargon were ruling. And they were not nice. They were sacking cities and taking what they wanted and that sort of thing. So in a way, it's kind of more Game of Thrones-ish in the fact that there's, all these things going on with the kingdoms and the people within them, and then with the added magic of the goddesses.
Okay. So do you, obviously you've got King Midas's kingdom and you've got Arcadia, but in the Sumerians, what other nation states and polities from the region and era did you play with at all?
In the first one, that's the main two, because Midas and Sargon are the enemies in this big story. Their story and Midas's desire for revenge is huge in book one. There is a little bit of mention of Lydia, which was a neighboring kingdom to the west, and they come in again in book two. Not a lot of talk about the Greeks, even though in history Midas was involved with the Greeks and he actually married a Greek princess. But for now, the core of the story is between Phrygia and Assyria. And then later on in the series, Lydia will come into play, and perhaps some areas of the South too. I'm still doing some research on that, but they're just now finding some new research about what was going on south of Phrygia at that time, and unearthing a potential new leader that they weren't even aware of, that may have lived down there and may have had some influence on what was going on then. So for now, it's very limited between those two. And then it will continue to expand a little bit into the other two books.
So obviously every author has their own newsletter. Is that something you talk about, the research you're doing? Because that could be fascinating in of itself, of these stories, actual history that you then incorporate into your fiction.
Well, thank you for saying that. Actually, my newsletter has been mostly focused on my website, which is Writing and Wellness. The newsletter that I have right now, that I have the most subscribers to, I started for writers, which, that's a whole other subject for anybody who may be a writer that's concerned about how do you start a newsletter, how do you market, all that sort of thing. When I was first starting, I wasn't sure what to do to try to get a website going and to try to get some attention. And the first one that I started, the first blog I started wasn't doing very well. So when I got my second novel publishing contract, I knew I kind of had to step it up and get something going. So I decided to combine my day job of being a freelance writer, because I focus on the health and wellness field, with my love of creativity and writing. And I created Writing and Wellness. And I talked there about being a physically, mentally, emotionally healthy writer, because this life can be difficult in so many ways, and nobody else is really talking about that. And I have a background in all of that, so it was a perfect fit. And that was where kind of my platform started and took off. I started getting readers there and started getting invitations to go talk at conferences and that sort of thing on those kind of topics. So I spent a lot of time building that. And with my freelance writing work, and then I was doing nonfiction books for writers. So there's been a lot of attention to that side of it. And now I'm kind of getting back more. I mean, I've been writing fiction all along, but I'm really wanting to focus much more on that in the future. So I'm just now starting my author newsletter, which will be separate. I really didn't know if I should separate them for a long time. And so I just stuck with the one that I have for writers. But I'm thinking now that separating is probably a good idea. So I do have an author newsletter, and in the future may share some of that. I'm very conscious about not boring my readers. So I don't know how much of that they would be interested in. That's nice for you to say that you think that would be interesting. So maybe I will touch on that a little bit. But so far I have not.
Anybody that's interested enough to read the a fantasy interpretation of the legend of King Midas, I imagine they're going to be fascinated by the true facts, because I mean most people don't realize that he was a real person.
No,
it's just one of the many legends. And so I don't know. Maybe it's because I'm a history major, so I'm biased. But
I'll give it a try. I'm sorry. I was just going to say, I'm just getting this started, and I think I probably will share some of that, especially as, with the book coming out and everything.
I was horrible at foreign languages, and to be an ancient or medieval historian, you have to learn various languages. I was bad enough at English, learning Old English or Old German or any of the other languages to be a classical historian. It was just woof. And it gets even worse the farther back you go. So I'm like, well, I'll just study American history because I can speak English already. but yeah, it's fascinating period. I took some of the classes on the Byzantine Empire, for instance, and all of that region. And it's our understanding of that local history is woefully inadequate, I think, because the focus of American education. So I don't know. I'd be fascinated. I'd sign up for a newsletter just for those stories.
Hey, yeah, please do. No, I hear what you're saying, and I was one of those people. I knew very little of that history or what was going on then, and did not receive much of that in school. And my family was very good about helping me to learn American history, but didn't learn much about that part of the world, especially not in that time. I think this project of working on the King Midas series has just been fascinating for that reason also, because I'm learning so much about what went on at that time in the world. I'm now a subscriber to Archaeology magazine, which I could have never imagined getting. But I'm getting that now because they will often have articles about that time and what was going on then. I just recently did some research on locks. I'm like, I need to make sure that the locks on my gates and all those are up to speed, and found this video on YouTube with this guy remaking this lock that they actually invented in 600 BC. That is just fascinating in its intricacy and how they made it to be able to slip in and slip out, and the notches they have and all the parts that are with it. And so it becomes like incredibly fascinating. I think if you're researching a story, and if you're someone who likes stories in the first place, because I think that's part of the thing that was missing in my history education, is that in school, you're sitting there and you're reading out of a textbook, and this happened on this date and this date, and you're like, ho hum. But when you get to read stories about real people and what happened to these people, it starts making it so much more interesting. And I've really enjoyed that part of it.
Yeah, that's one of the things I learned early on, because they had some really good history teachers, is history is just stories. They're just people that existed before you. I mean, you can learn things from them. But I mean, once you know how to find the dates, that's not as important. You need a base understanding of what happened when, sort of sequentially. But other than that, like at a certain point in time, you can Google it. You can, when I was going to school, it was the card catalog and the Dewey Decimal System, but you could look it up. So you
yeah, it's so true. Yeah.
It was about understanding how to do the research was the big key. And then understanding that these were all just stories, and learning to, primary sources is the key, meaning it was written by people at the time or as close to contemporary as you can get. Because sometimes people will write their autobiographies or their journals or whatever decades after the event happened. But it's learning how to read between the lines of their own biases too, because just because somebody wrote it back then, it doesn't mean it's necessarily true. Like they have their own bias. So it's always fascinating. And then to see them, there's a new strain of history training that they're doing. I can't remember the exact title for it, but it's basically like hands-on history, where they're like living in the way they might have lived for a little bit, not as reenactors, but actual to understand, like, this is what went into making this, and this is what went into, to lighting, even just as simple as lighting a fire, we take it for granted that you flip a switch and your gas lighter goes, or you get a match. Well, that wasn't always a thing. So it's always fascinating to read that kind of stuff. There's actually been a bunch on the ancient Romans where they had this war horn that they would use. You see it in the carvings and the reliefs, but no one knew what they looked like. So someone actually started like 3D modeling it based on the images, and they finally were able to make it. I'm like, crap, that is actually kind of scary.
Yeah.
So to see that, I didn't realize locks went back though. That's fascinating.
It is fascinating, and I think you're exactly right as far as well, I guess I probably didn't have very good history teachers because they weren't very good at trying to get you into the actual stories. And then the thing that I think that I've been most impressed with is how industrious these people were, how smart they were, how much they knew, because we tend to think that we know so much more now. We're so much more advanced, and then you look back and you say, well, actually, they had that stuff then. I mean, I have made the daughter in King Midas sort of an engineer. She loves to put things together and create things. And I have her be the one that kind of brings the idea of a crane to her father, because the crane was invented in 600 BC. And you think of that and you're like, no way, they had that way back then. And so I think with our technology and everything today, we tend to think that we're maybe a little bit more advanced than we really are, because these people knew how to do stuff, and they were making things back then that were really useful to help them live their lives.
I mean, they found the first, essential, almost a computer in the form of a mechanical device they used to calculate astrology and weather patterns. It was too complex to be a simple machine, but not really a computer, but it's as close as analog they can give people. We still don't know how they made Greek fire, other than we suspect it might be a napalm derivative. Da Vinci invented the helicopter and the parachute before. I mean, obviously, they didn't build all of his devices, but I think Mythbusters built a couple of them just to see, and they actually functioned based on his specs.
Oh yeah, I've seen some of those too. Yeah, that's fascinating when they do that.
Yeah, so I mean, you read and you just assume that they were more cavemen back then.
Yes.
Until you see, some of the sophistications.
Sophistication is a good word for it, because, like I say, when I was looking at that lock video, and maybe I can give you the link for that so you could attach it.
I love it. I love that.
Yeah, because watching how they made that, and you see how sophisticated they were with their tools. I mean, it almost seems like it would take more brain power to be able to make something like that out of such simple materials than what we have today.
Yeah, I mean, you think about like just the standing stones, and you look at what that and how far that stone material had to travel, and what would have been involved in that in an era where they were doing everything either by brute force or using basic physics like rolling bars and floating it with water, and all of the movements that would be required to make that work. You don't think of that as a moron when you have nothing to base it on, right? Like that.
That's right.
Ingenuity at the beginning, where it's easier to get creative when somebody else did it this way. Maybe if I do it a little bit different, but when no one's done it yet, that's where you're like, man, these guys were kind of smart.
Yeah.
They do that a lot with like the pyramids and what would have been involved. Everyone's like, oh, aliens did it because we can't figure out how they did it without all those tools.
That's right.
or the Romans, how they built roads that were so straight and level that even thousands of years later, because they over-engineered everything, because they couldn't just go to the Grocery store or go to the Home Depot or whatever, so stuff had to last.
That's
it's
right.
fascinating. Are you familiar with Curiosity Stream?
It sounds vaguely familiar, but not no.
It is. We are not sponsored by them, dear listener. I absolutely love it. It's a series much like Netflix, but it's all documentaries. And I watched the heck out of that. Yeah, it's all one word. It's like Netflix. I think it's like $40 a year. No, $120. I don't know. Whatever it is, it feels like I'm underpaying. But I watched the heck out of all those documentaries. They got a little bit of everything: some natural science, some physics, space stuff, history stuff. Like you name it, nice. They've got it. I got into that when COVID locked down and the kids were all doing their homeschooling. I'm like, well, let's see what we got that's educational TV. So
for sure,
it beat just them watching Saturday morning cartoons, right? So
absolutely,
it became like a family thing. I recommend that. They've got a lot on ancient history too.
Cool.
Might generate some ideas. So
yeah, it might.
is there any point in time where you think after this King Midas series where you're going to play more in the historical fiction?
That is a good question because, like I say, I never would have seen myself doing that. But I've had so much fun with it that I don't know at this point. We'll see what happens after this series is finished. I was actually thinking the other day of maybe doing a prequel as far as what happened before, because there's a prologue in the story when King Midas was a boy, and there might be an untold story there as far as leading up to when he was king. I allude to it a little bit in the story just to set the background, but there might be that. So I don't know because, like I say, it's been so fun to do. I just kind of have to see where the muse takes me, I guess, when I finish this series.
Yeah, I've wanted to do stuff like that, and maybe someday I will. My problem is I know I love the research. Like I was a research as a history grad student. And so I'm like, if I do that, you might lose me.
You'll dive in too deep.
Yeah, I'll dive in too deep, right? You stare into the abyss, and the abyss stares back. Like it might be another decade before anyone sees me again. I'll just be like covered in sitting in a library somewhere having the time of my life. So there's danger there of falling off the deep end.
I can totally get that. I don't think I share that because for me, after a while, I want to get into the drama of it. I want to get into the story of it. I enjoy the research, but to a certain point, then I'm ready to take off and do a story on it. But I can totally understand how that would happen because anytime that I've started to do research, boy, the time just flies by in a hurry.
Yeah, I think the weird thing is with fiction, I'm sorry, versus nonfiction is in nonfiction, I can tell you exactly what happened. If I put it in a fiction story, sometimes, oh, that's unbelievable. I'm like, wait a minute, no, that happened to Bob. I know that guy. But if you write it in fiction, I'm like, oh, you just made that up. So it's fascinating to see some of the stuff in history. And I'm like, I know this happened, but if I wrote about it, they're going to say it's unbelievable.
I just read that the novel that is now I think it's the Hulu series, the We Were the Lucky Ones, about the Polish family during World War II and how they all survived. And when I was reading the story, I was thinking, if this wasn't a true story, I wouldn't believe it. Yeah, there was times when something happens to the character that I was like, if this was real, this person would be dead now. And you get to the end of the book, no, this is a true story. This whole family survived, which is amazing. And I think if it wouldn't have been true, I probably wouldn't have believed it.
Yeah, that was the first lesson I learned when I wrote a scene for my first series. I sent it to the publisher, it was a British publisher. And he's like, no, you got to take this out, JR. No one's going to believe this. And I'm like, I'm sending him the incident statement. It happened to me. And he's like, no, I believe you, sir. But like, it's one of those things where you write in fiction, people are just going to, they're not going to suspend their disbelief.
That's
so
right.
I've had to learn that sometimes there's technically right. And there's, convincing the reader it's close enough.
That's right.
So, sometimes, but that's the fascinating part about history is there's just so much of that there.
Well, and we seem to forgive it more, if we know that it's true, then, oh, okay, well, we'll believe it. But fiction, it's like, there's like a higher bar or something.
So when you write this fiction set in this ancient world, did you try to go within a sort of ancient speech pattern? I don't know what that would be like, but when you have them in the dialogue, or did you just keep it modern English?
No, I kept it very modern because my main concern is that it's a readable story and that people enjoy reading it. And that I enjoy writing it. And so going that far, I'm not Tolkien making up the elven languages and all of that. I'd never make that. To me, I would probably get bored too fast. So no, it's just standard language. And be honest, the language back then, again, the records are a little bit sparse for Phrygia in particular, but they do kind of know what the language was. But as far as being able to reproduce it at any level, that would be really difficult.
So there's two parts for that. One, there's a whole field of science of actually inventing new languages. A lot of authors, after Tolkien sort of set the bar, so other authors did it. Star Trek even did it with so the Klingon is an actual functional language. So like there is a trait to that. I don't know unless you're like writing the next Hobbit or Lord of the Rings, where it's going to be read 100,000 years from now. It's really worth the effort to make up a language that no one but you is ever going to speak.
But he was a linguist, right? He was that first.
So
I think his interest was kind of already there. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and you know, he also wrote his therapy to combat his experience on the Somme. So he's a World War One veteran. But I mean, in
Exactly.
general, I don't know that there's a lot necessarily served by having, you know, making up a language for a story. But more what I was asking was, obviously the speech patterns, say in medieval France, is different than they might speak today, as far as the way they would construct sentences, the kind of words they would speak. You know, the English equivalent would be like, if you try to speak Shakespearean to people, like, we could understand you mostly, but that's not how we talk now. You've gone far enough back that we know what the written language looks like, but that doesn't necessarily mean that translates to the spoken language.
I was careful not to have too many modern words in it. I know I like took out every okay that I had in there and made sure that it was all right. You know, I tried to make sure that it was, as far as that goes, there's no, you know, slang in there or words that only we would know. That's as far as I took it.
Okay. Yeah, I've had to do that with medieval, and I'm like, man, I could go full accurate, but no one would understand what the hell they're saying for a short story I did. And I'm like, nah, we'll split the baby and we'll throw in a few prithys and whilsts. And although I will say, if you ever are stumped for insults for your alien species or whatever, some of the medieval insults are kind of hilarious.
Yeah, I can imagine.
You should look into those.
Well, I did add some humor to this book, which I had never done before. But
Oh,
when I was first starting to write it, I was thinking of the musical angle, and any musical that you go see, there's always humor in it. And so I wanted to have that, and I ended up with 3 advisors to the king that ended up being the perfect avenue to explore that, and that ended up being a ton of fun. And I have retained them, you know, for the second book. I'm sure they'll go on because they became favorite characters of the beta readers. And so it's just the interaction between the 3 of them that ends up creating some silly and some funny moments that I really enjoy doing. So they're not really, there is one advisor that is sort of insulting in a way, but you always totally agree with his insults, the way that he says them. So
okay. How long do you see this series going?
For now, just to the 3. Like I say, I've drafted the second, and I'm starting to get ideas together for the third. At this point, that's where I am. But like I say, I'm a pantser, so I just kind of go with what feels right at the time. So yeah, don't lock me in on that, but that's what I'm thinking now.
So we'll fast forward into the future. You've got, you know, your 100,000 books in the King Midas trilogy. Go full Bain publishing on it, where trilogy sometimes means 12 books. What if you were going to do another historically inspired story? What era do you think might be fun to play in?
Oh my gosh, I haven't even thought of that. That's a really good question. How about you? Do you think of that?
I do. We interviewed a lady, Melissa McShane, who's got me curious and into game lit after I worked with James Ward. And I'm like, this is kind of fun. I like gaming. I grew up on Skyrim and Elder Scrolls and Morrowind and all the video game RPGs, the open world ones. And I'm like, and I started playing tabletop. I could do this. I could do the gaming thing. And so I started looking into it. And as part of that, we interviewed Melissa, and she's got one where it's like the Napoleonic Wars, but you got people with magic there too.
Yeah.
That would be kind of cool. So I'm just imagining like Lexington and Concord if we had wizards. Like, I could see that being kind of cool. I know.
Is that kind of like the Pride and Prejudice with zombies?
Yeah, but everything's cooler with zombies. I love the heck. I know people like lambast that movie, but I loved the heck out of it. I was like, hell yeah. I've watched it like 9 times. I know.
Well, it's so fun to play with, isn't it? I mean,
it is.
Yeah, I can see it. Well, and the whole idea of combining myth with history, I think I'm a fan of that now, because
yes,
that kind of like automatically gave me the fantasy element that I kind of need to have. I like to play with, you know, in fictional worlds where things are let's see, how do you say? I think those of us who like fantasy and science fiction like to go a little bit beyond reality, so we can play with subjects at kind of a deeper level where we're not like locked into what the rules of reality are. So being able to have the myth there was kind of like a guidance system for what the fantasy side of it would be like. And then using the history as the backdrop, it ended up making the story easier to write for me as someone who just typically pantses their way through. I don't plot ahead of time, but that kind of gives you the structure right there, is what to play with. So I can see potentially wanting to do that again in the future. As far as which myth to pursue, I don't know. You've been diving into some of those myths, you said, on the Scottish history.
I have. It's a lot of fun. So like, I'm just thinking when we were talking, I know Hulu has a series about if witches were real and the Salem witch trials, those were real witches and they made an agreement.
Mm-hmm.
They formed their sort of secret government society. I don't have Hulu, so I haven't watched it. I've seen some of the commercials. It's almost one I'd like. I mean, I might have to buy that as a box set because I can't afford another subscription service. It's like everybody and their mother wants you to do another subscription. Like at this point, can I just have cable back? And we went pretty much back there, right? We went full circle. But so that's an interesting one. And then, they did the Sleepy Hollow retelling, where Ichabod Crane was like brought forward because he was fighting evil, good versus evil, and the Brits were working with the devil, which, my patriotic American soul kind of liked that. And so like, they had this horseman was actually like one of the horsemen of the apocalypse. And so there's so much room to just mix it and then take that moment. And, because I'm a military brat and I grew up in a military family, like we'd study history, and a lot of times history is the study of this battle or whatever. And I'm like, I wonder what would happen if they had an AK-47 there instead, Harry Potter famously did that with the Civil War, like, and so I don't know, there's so much room. Guns of the South.
Well, it does definitely open up a lot of new avenues that I hadn't thought about before.
Yeah,
that are just so much fun to explore, like you say, that I could see myself continuing that way. I don't know. I guess we'll see how Midas does and go from there. But yeah, there's, like you say, there's endless possibilities when you start diving into it.
And if you want to do the world building right, you have to start thinking of like, well, we devised a machine that did X. Would we do that if we had magic that could just do it? Would anybody have invented the cigarette lighter if you had a wizard that could just, flip his fingers and little flames pop out or whatever, or you could enchant a magic item. So it does get you to a point where, where those lines would intersect.
Right.
It can be fun. And then,
are they operating in secrets or what? Yep.
Yeah. And then you got the troglodyte, the ones that, didn't like the new technology. So they went and broke up the printing press or whatever. Like you'd have those contrarians. It'd be like, no, you take your magic and go home. So I don't know, there's so much room for fun. Just taking the extremes of human nature.
For sure. And I was able to get around that issue by having the only magic be with the gods. They're the only ones that possess any sort of magical power. So that made that line a little easier to follow, at least for this story.
But that's exactly as it was with the myths and the legends of the ancients, the classical stuff. So, oh man.
Yeah, and one of the gods that enters in book 2 was actually one that they worshipped at that time in that area. So that ends up being a good place to pull from as well.
I don't know. So when I was in Iraq, I realized when I went there the first time, I was like, I want to understand where I'm going. So I studied the history of the region. And you realize that Iraq now is part of what was ancient Mesopotamia, which is like, for the Christian West, it's like one of the most mentioned words in the Bible is Mesopotamia, because so much of what happened in the Bible happened in that region. And so if you go back before, obviously, Christianity, and you look at some of their religious beliefs, it's fascinating. And, having walked the steps of some of those ancient places, it definitely changes your appreciation for them. Like I've actually stood on the ziggurat of Ur from the top, and you can look out and you see the town that was just offset of the top of the ziggurat. And of course, now it's sand dunes from the ground. You just see hills of sand. But when you get up top, you can see the silhouette of the building frames or what's left of it, where, where the streets were and where the buildings were. And, that one had a, what do you call it? A pantry or a closet or something. Cause you could see that smaller square, we don't know what they did with it. Well, I don't. Maybe somebody's actually done the archaeology of that. I don't know. But, and, building at the top where they actually did the human sacrifices or animal sacrifices. And you could see where the blood has changed the color from the copper in the blood of the stones that even 2,000 years later, you can still see.
Wow.
It definitely standing in like American history is so new in the grander scheme of things. Like
very true.
It's so well, there were cultures here obviously before, but they didn't leave as much permanence as what you see in the Middle East or in Europe. And so standing in the footsteps of your ancestors, it's definitely changes your perspective, I think.
I totally agree. Yeah, I don't have as much experience as you, but I did visit Ireland, and I did feel that while I was there. We visited several castles, which I'm so glad we did, because now I have a castle in the story and I have something to pull from. But yeah, you just kind of feel that. You feel that age and that history when you're in those areas. And you mentioned the stories in the Bible. I've noticed some of the happenings that went on there too, crossing what was said in the Bible. And I haven't done a lot of research on how those two are connected, but I have noticed places where they kind of are. Yeah, it's like you could go on for years, I'm sure, digging into all of that. But like you say, it is very fascinating, and you start to be able to feel this thread going through so much of what we think we know now.
If you take the religion aspect out of the Bible, it still serves as generally speaking, as a historical text.
Right.
People were writing contemporary to the era about things that were going on. You could do that with the Torah. You can do that with the Quran as well. At a certain level, religion aside, they're the story of our ancestors. And so there's definitely, it's fascinating to read all of that. And then every time we turn around, we're discovering new stuff that's just so fascinating. Like they've started using helicopter-borne LiDAR, which is a form of ground-penetrating radar. And they've been going over the South American jungles, and they're finding entire Mesopotamian cities. Like, I don't know. I grew up with the Aztec jaguar kind of motif. You see it like on some of the Indiana Jones type stuff. And so now that they're making more discoveries, and it's so much more fascinating than we even knew. Like, I don't know. I could see there's plenty of stories there too.
Oh, for sure.
And it's an excuse to get a as you travel.
Well, that ground penetrating radar is amazing. What they're finding with that, I think, is unbelievable. And that brings me back, to Midas. People can go to the University of Pennsylvania right now and punch in, King Midas, and you'll see the pictures of the excavation that they're doing right now. And it's like you just go deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper, and you start finding all the roads and all the buildings and where they were. And they've even found evidence of a devastating fire that occurred at a certain time there. That's going to figure in book 2. So it's like, what's under our feet? There's so much down there.
Yeah, I remember when I went to, as an undergrad, like the legends of Troy were just that, legends, right? They were the epic poem, Oedipus and Homer and all of that. And now they're doing actual archaeology. They think they've actually found the real city of Troy. And it's every time we turn around, it's like, wait, that was real? I mean, they add stuff to it, right, to make, because it's legend. But I mean, finding that kernel of truth and then, watching it grow in a different direction because you're telling a fiction story can be fun. That what if factor.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, and the human nature stays the same regardless. So it's like, you can create a story of the humans that lived then and sort of come to some understanding of what it must have been like for them.
Has your research into the ancients in the the region, has that changed how you look at just in general the larger modern society? Because now you're looking at society as it was thousands of years ago. That was for me realizing how much hasn't changed. As much as we think we've evolved, like, we've got the same struggles, we've got the same issues.
So true.
Faster communication is about the difference in human nature.
Yeah, faster communications and more distracted.
Yeah.
But no, you're exactly right. The human nature element stays the same as far as the issues that they face and all that sort of thing. I think the biggest impact it's had on me as far as how I look at society now is what we were talking about earlier, and how brilliant they were and how resourceful they were and how much they knew already at that time. You realize that so many things that we think are fairly new that we've learned are not. They're very, very old. People knew them way back then. And so I think that's been the biggest impact on me as I look around and think, okay, so we have technology, but the advancements maybe aren't as much as we think. People have always been resourceful, have always been smart, have always been able to build things to make life better in whatever area they were in.
So one of the things that evolves over time, and it goes the yin and it fluctuates based on the needs of the time. but the role of the genders and what women were allowed to do evolves, and it's constantly flowing both directions based on where you are and what's going on in the world, because obviously women are more at risk in times of upheaval. You're writing about a time when it started as stable, and obviously it becomes less stable because of the war. So did you dive into that with the female characters? Because that could be fascinating to look at, because it's different than our experience.
I did. In fact, Midas's sister ends up being enslaved by King Sargon, and so that's one of the big motivations he has to defeat Sargon, is hopefully to save her. But yeah, the role of women in Sargon's world, particularly, they're they don't have any rights. She's basically property. And then the role of Midas's daughter is somewhat different because she is a king's daughter. And so he does allow her to do more than what maybe many of them were allowed to do then, but still, she is not able to assume rule or anything like that. That goes to her brother. I did find in some of my research, and this came from the archaeology magazine, that there were women in Assyria at that time that did run businesses. And I think they're just finding some of this, as we become more interested in what were the roles of women back then. They have found that in times when the husbands couldn't be there, that a lot of times the wives would continue with whatever trading business that they had started. And that there was many women during that time that actually did very well for themselves, who were managing large businesses, as business was in that time. So I've kind of been finding, in just doing the research, I don't have a lot of this yet, but I've been finding that there were women that had power in that time. Not necessarily, they weren't ruling, sometimes they weren't royalty, they weren't, running a kingdom, but they were allowed to run businesses at certain times under certain restrictions.
So it's the difference between covert versus overt power. Like, obviously, the whispering behind the throne sometimes can be more powerful than the guy sitting on it, whether that's the advisors or the wives or daughters or whatever. But even in the same era, like the women in Spartan versus the women in Athens versus the women in Phoenicia all had different roles and different levels of what was attainable. I know we like to think as Americans that Rosie the Riveter was somehow groundbreaking and new, because it did change our modern culture. But the idea that women stepped in to fill the voids when men were off to war, like, that goes back to the caveman days. like that's a story as old as Cain and Abel, right? Because
sure, absolutely,
life doesn't stop just because your men are away, marauding or doing whatever.
Right. And there's differences between the kingdoms too, from what I'm seeing. And like I say, the records for Phrygia are nearly non-existent. I don't know if it was because the fires, they were just lost. But you're seeing in some of the records around the other areas like Lydia or Syria that, there were women that were managing a lot more than what we might have thought they did at that point.
That's why historians like me and nerds of all things ancient are still mourn the loss of the library, the Great Library. It's too soon, though. We won't talk more about it. So have you learned anything in preparing for this story that surprised you?
Oh, there was a lot. I mean, the first thing was just that King Midas was a real person. I mean, who would ever have guessed that, growing up and hearing the legend? I think if I were to speak maybe from a writing point of view, learning how to do different types of stories. My first story was just kind of a made up epic fantasy. And then I went towards supernatural. I'm really not sure why. That just kind of ended up well, my second story, Lorena's Gift, there was an inspiration for that. I think I was reading Deepak Chopra or something, and he was talking about how the afterlife could be as the person thought that it was going to be, that our own point of view had a lot to do with it. And I kind of took that idea and ran with it for that story. I think for me in writing, it's kind of like these things that appeal to me, I want to explore more. But with Midas, it was like, finding out that there was this real king that was really alive during that time, and then finding out how much these people knew back then and how industrious they were, and that there's this totally different way to write a story. I mean, you kind of think as a writer that maybe this is how you write, after you've done so many books, this is kind of how it comes to me and how I proceed with it. But I've now learned that there's other ways to play around with coming up with ideas for stories or plot lines for stories, or just to be able to have fun with creating a story. So I think that is something I learned, at least on the writing side. The rest of it is stuff we've already been talking about as far as the whole historical side.
There's actually, so in preparation for this interview, I did some research myself just because it was a reason and excuse, and I don't need much excuses to dive in all things ancient. But so they did the initial excavation of the tomb. They found actual King Midas's tomb in 1956, 57. I can't remember, but it's UPenn.
Yes, and I have that at the beginning of my story. Yes.
Yeah, it was UPenn that was sponsored that archaeological dig.
Yes.
And they actually found, and since then, as they've been going through the grave goods, if they've been going through what they've discovered, they realize there's an iron oxide on a lot of the clothing specific to that kingdom that would have given a golden appearance. And they think maybe that's the reason behind the golden
Yes, I read that too. That's bizarre, isn't it? Yeah, because the Greeks came up with that myth. And so they had to pull from something to come up with that myth of him. And
most myth and legends and ancient deities and all of that, it came from trying to understand what they didn't have the science to understand yet. So they wanted to understand the natural world around them, the weather patterns, what happens to them when they die, where they come from. And so they created these stories to tell themselves that. So it makes sense to me that, just like we found with Troy, like there's a kernel of truth in all of it. And finding that truth can sometimes be as much fun as the story itself, I think.
So. I think, and I hear you on that. I did read that. And the whole thing of, in the myth, he has to step into the river. I'm forgetting the name of it. It starts with a P, I think. He has to step into the river to be washed so that the curse is washed away. And I heard something that they found that there was some of that in the river as well that would create kind of that gold flecked appearance.
Have you heard of the YouTube channel Tasting History?
No.
So this guy, he actually quit a pretty high-paying gig because he made enough following. He basically goes through various eras of history and he finds the dishes that they would have eaten and he makes them and he tries them on camera and he figures out how to recreate them with what's available modern. We mentioned in the pre-show that, or maybe it was in the early show, I can't remember. It all blurs together. But for instance, they found George Washington's hard cider recipe. Now, obviously, we've changed the way fruits taste. And you talk to your grandmother, tomatoes tasted different back then. Some of it is, we get old, we get curmudgeon-y. Some of it is in an effort to make things bigger and more visually appealing so they sell better. You've lost some of the nutrient density and some of the flavor. So biologists and arborists went and they reverse engineered the apple to what it would have tasted like as best we can guess back then. And it definitely changed the flavor of things. So he basically takes that concept and he does it throughout history. So like he made garum, which is like the fish sauce that the Romans put on everything. Stuff's disgusting. I don't know why they like that. Maybe that's why they were such brutal people, because they had to eat that fish stuff. But like he goes throughout history and he's done some of the ancient countries in the vicinity of this where this is happening. I seem to remember he did one where he found a Sumerian recipe. It was a dessert that he made. So it's fascinating to think. You think back then they would have, it's just they threw some meat over a fire and that's about the extent of it. And then you see like the feast. I'm like, man, these people knew what they were doing. They were eating good.
Yeah, I do have a feast scene in the book, and I had to do some research on what were the foods they ate at that time. Unfortunately, I did find some papers that were written on that. I was surprised that they had pancakes. They actually had pancakes back then. I'm sure they were different than the ones we have now, but they had pancakes. And I actually had a beta reader say, well, wait, they wouldn't have pancakes then, would they? It's like, yeah, they actually did. We're not talking IHOP here, but they did have pancakes.
Yes, you had to say IHOP on the day that I restarted my diet. Oh, that's just mean. I love pancakes. But yeah, so it's no, you're fine. You're fine. I would check it out just if you're interested, dear listener, to you too as well. It is fascinating, and he's just going back because that old quote, the army marches on its belly. There's some truth to that without the food, nothing else happens. And our understanding of what that meant is just vastly different. I mean, if you look in your pantry right now, one of your $5, sage containers was a king's ransom back then in the medieval Europe, right? Like spices being what they were. So even just that affects things. I mean, there are literal wars that were fought over control of flavor, essentially, for food.
Yep.
So it's all fascinating. with this getting, circling back, because we've gotten way off topic, because I do that with all things history. Normally my co-host would be here to like grab the hook thing and they are shut up, we're going far afield. It's dangerous to put me on a panel with someone who also loves history. Do you think you'll ever take the kinds of concepts you're researching now, the ancient, regardless of how far back you go, and see what it might be like to throw a modern person back then?
Now that's an interesting idea. I had not thought of that, but it's a good idea.
I remember when I was taking my ancient language
That's
overview
kind of like
class.
Outlander, right? I mean,
Yes.
that's kind of that idea, yeah.
Or the Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. They've
Yeah, yeah.
actually done the language checks, and I think like 1500s is about as far back as you could go in modern English and
Yeah.
understand, or
There would be
modern
that,
French.
yeah.
Because if you go back farther than that, it might be French, but it's a different language. Or it might be English, but it's Old English or Middle English. And so there'd be the language barrier. But if you're going back to the Middle East, there's already a language barrier. So the assumption is it's already there. It might be a little less daunting in that region.
True.
I don't know. It's just a fascinating.
Well, now that I'm so fully immersed in this time, I think I'd want to take them to that time, because like, now that I've done so much research on it and I've got, characters there and everything, the idea is kind of intriguing to now, put someone there that I don't know how you would manage that, because I think, then they were some Hittite language or something. I don't know if I'm even pronouncing that right, but the language barrier would be a big thing, but it would be fun to be able to just play around with that. They'd have to have some sort of translator, but even that, I mean, there's not enough that exists of the language to be able to even create a translator, I don't think.
They did, I can't remember what they found. I think it was a Sumerian song that they actually recreated one of the Sumerian instruments to play this song, which was surprisingly elegant. But yeah, so we're still learning, and I find that fascinating. I don't know enough about the medieval or Middle East languages to know. I know on the English tree, it's the way we emphasize the pronunciations and where the consonants and which words you roll and which ones you don't. Like linguists will probably like, you're getting it all wrong, JR. But there's like definite a change in pronunciation as language evolved. And so it'd be interesting to even think about what that might sound like. And it's all guesswork. I mean,
well, I did have fun that you mentioned that. I do have, because in the myth of King Midas, one of the other myths that's associated with him involves music. And so the king has a contest in the book, because there was a contest like that in one of the myths that he's involved with. And I was able to go back and research ancient instruments, which, being a musician, that was really, really fun. And one of the instruments that was primary then, that I have one of the primary characters playing, was called an oud, O-U-D. It's a stringed instrument, sort of like a guitar. And I found on YouTube some music actually played on an old oud, and it was awesome. I just loved the music. So I ended up playing that when I was writing a lot of the scenes in the book, the whole bringing back the music that was then, and the type of double reed instruments they had. And they had a lot of flutes, of course, and a harp and all that kind of thing. Ended up being a lot of fun for the story.
I mean, we know they would have had at least a minimum of a flute. Flutes are pretty universal.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even Neanderthals, they found bone flutes. So you could do that. Most of it would have been by memorization, because they weren't writing sheet music back then.
Mm-hmm.
But I think oral tradition, it makes sense, since oral tradition for history, that it would be the same with music.
Well, and it was just fun to explore. And of course, I was thinking, if this would ever become a musical, you'd want to have some sort of a musical bent there. And I was thinking that was just kind of envisioning the music contest, and being able to actually get a hold of an old oud and have somebody play it would be fun. So
is it closer to a lute or a harp?
Yeah, I think there's similarities there. Yeah, closer to a lute probably.
Okay.
It's a little bit lower pitched when I was thinking of it.
Okay. I'm just thinking of all the music theory classes I had to take as a band student, as an undergrad, and now I'm fascinated. Like, would they even do it on 4/4, or what clef would they? Anyway, we're losing our audience.
It's got that Middle Eastern. Yeah, we are. It's got that Middle Eastern, kind of vibe to it, kind of a twang to it. But but I enjoyed that instrument a little bit more than some of the other Middle Eastern ones that I've heard.
Yeah, and a lot of their instruments had to be more portable, because they were moving around more.
Sure. Yeah.
And so that makes a difference too, because you can't have anything too heavy.
Right.
Weight is a factor. And then, They didn't have to worry about as much about moisture back then. You did have to worry about dry rot, though. And
Moisture is always a thing with the wood and string instruments for sure.
Yeah.
And temperature, yeah.
It'd be worse, I'm imagining, in the Amazons than it would be, say, in Babylon, I would think.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But before I put everyone to sleep, because you and I are probably the only two people on the planet interested in all of this, if they want to know more, obviously, this episode we're recording a little bit in advance because you're getting the book ready to launch. When we air this, the book will be at least available for pre-sale. I'm assuming that by then you'll have your newsletter up. So
it's up now.
Oh, outstanding!
It's just fairly new, yeah.
So we can link to all that in the show notes. She's going to tell us in just a second where you can find her. This is the part where I remind you, dear listener, to please be kind and speak your mind on the reviewing platforms. Your reviews help the right reader find the right book. So do your part. It really helps. It also helps new and struggling creatives to get their story out there. The reviews tweak the algorithms, which is how the robot overlords, praise be, tell new people that this is a book you should look at. With the automated suggestion system. So, you really are helping out. If you can't buy a dozen copies for your friends, the least you could do is throw a little review up there. It really does make a world of a difference for such a small thing. So with that being said, where can they find you on the wild, wild interwebs?
I have two main sites. The first is my author site, which is just my name, ColleenMStory.com. That's easy to find. And my author newsletter is there. And then I'm also, if you have any writers that are interested, I have the writingandwellness.com, and that's all spelled out. And is spelled out. And there's a bunch of motivational articles there. And I also have a newsletter for writers there. And then on both of those sites, you can find all my other links.
So for the writer side, normally, obviously we're very focused on the consumers of the content and not how to be authors. I really don't feel like my sales warrant me telling anyone how to run their career. It sounds like you're not necessarily doing the business of being a writer, but more of how to be a writer by take care of your health at the same time. Is that correct?
A little bit of both. I do have some on there about, creating a platform and managing and marketing your books. I mean, obviously that comes in if you're a writer. So I do have some articles on that. But yes, a lot of it is on boosting creativity, finding time to write, boosting productivity, and then, how to keep your creativity alive. I mean, after you've been writing for a long time and really busy, it's really kind of easy to burn out. So overcoming that, and if you're sitting at the computer all day, how to counteract that, because we know how bad that is for us. So yeah, it's kind of covering all those topics.
Cool. All right. And so if you're one of the 12 authors listening, check that out too. It'll all be linked in the show notes. You can find us on our Linktree, linktr.ee, Linktree/Blasters and Blades podcast. Again, Linktree/Blasters and Blades podcast, where we link to all the things, the BitChutes, the Rumbles, the YouTube, the Twitter, the TikTok. We've got our email, blastersandbladespodcast@gmail.com, for professional purposes only, people. I'm looking at you, Carl. We've got our Facebook group and Facebook page. And most importantly, we've got Madam Stabby Stab on the Instagram, Twitter, and email, where you can send all of your shenanigans. She revels in that nonsense. So send it to her. Keep her busy. If every letter you send her is 1 second, she's not stabbing poor Nick. We have our website at anchor.fm/blasters-and-blades. Again, anchor.fm/ Blasters, Tack, and Tack Blades. Ooh, had a brain fart for a second. Where you can support the show for as little as 99 cents a month. Your contribution can help keep the lights on. These episodes aren't free to produce, and every penny helps. We have be able to support the show more directly at buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Handley. Again, buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Handley. Where you can support the show. Be sure to put in the comment section that it's for the podcast. And I promise I will keep my co-hosts duly caffeinated. They will drink the coffee until their eyes turn brown. I don't know if their eyes are brown yet. Anyway, I'm colorblind, people, but just go with it, okay? It's a marketing thing. Or you could support us by purchasing Coffee Brand Coffee. Links in the show notes. Podcast Grunts is the code, and you get 10% off of the finest coffee you can buy that's made in America, roasted in America. You support your fellow countrymen if you're from here. I don't know if they ship internationally yet, but they're working on it. And it's just it's a fun supporting an actual company that tries to give back to the community, to hiring locals and not just outsourcing everything overseas, because sometimes that's cheaper. I appreciate the efforts there. With that being said, thank you for spending some of your precious time with us. For my crazy co-host, I am J.R. Handley, and this was the Blasters and Blades podcast. We'll be back next week at the same time, where we'll indulge our love of nerd culture, cheesy jokes, and all things that go boom. And I apologize for nothing when we went too nerdy on the history. Just bear with me for this one day, okay, people? Got to give me something. All right. Thank you for coming on, Colleen. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you, JR. Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.
All right. And with that, dear listener, we are